Shabbat shalom, everybody. Good evening. Hello, and peace be unto everyone who listens in today. It's your sister Shaya, the her historian, here with another episode of Sister for Sister Storytime. Still reading the book Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth. Okay, so the sun cult. The worship of the sun god and an all male priesthood was typically established, as in Babylon and Egypt, by the edict of a military dictatorship. In pre patriarchal Egypt, the goddess Nekhebt, the vulture, was worshipped in Upper Egypt, and Azit, the cobra goddess, in Lower Egypt. Nekhebt was the inventor of agriculture, a great healer and physician, and the bringer of laws and justice. Egypt was strongly matriarchal, and women entered and achieved in all professions. After the invasion of Egypt by Indo-Europeans circa 3000 BC, Lower and Upper Egypt were united under a newly instituted kingship, and the dynastic era began. The invaders, calling themselves the followers of Horus, formed an aristocracy or a master race that ruled over all Egypt. The word pharaoh or paro means simply great house, was applied to the royal male alone. Male deities quickly then rose to power over the Egyptian goddess. Horus, the god of light, was transformed into the official son of the great mother Isis. Isis comes from Aset, the throne and immortal queen of heaven. Isis incorporated the more ancient Azit, the great cobra goddess who created all existence. She also wore the vulture wings belonging to Nekhebt. Together with her brother and moon lover Osiris, Isis was worshipped by the common people far into Roman times. Her cult became the most important mystery religion of Rome itself, and Isis with the Horus child is reflected in the Roman Catholic worship of the Madonna and the child. Isis, like the great goddess everywhere, was the still point of the turning world. Crowned by the lunar disk, she rises from the ocean at night to say, I am nature, the universal mother. Single manifestation of all gods and goddesses am I. In Bronze Age Egypt, the cult of the sun god Ra was introduced by a privileged male priesthood for their own political and military purposes. The older lunar calendar was changed into a solar calendar through the introduction of 5 intercalary days. To accommodate this new belief, the resurrected moon god Osiris was re-identified by the priesthood with the sun. The people were now supposed to forget what was written on the gate of the ancient goddess Nut, where what there is, what will be, what has been is me. Nobody has uncovered my shaitan. The fruit that I bore was the sun. Instead of being the fruit of the great mother tree, the male governors of the Egyptian dynasties now pretended to have been created by a father god. He, Ta, was supposed to have created the other gods through an act of masturbation. Right on, Ta. Ramses II the Great was a Bronze Age pharaoh, probably identical with the pharaoh of the biblical record. Ramses II declared himself born by the sun god Ra. During 67 years of Hasidic rule, he hammered his superiority into the heads of the people and had built for him countless temples and palaces stretching from the Nile Delta through Luxor and Karnak to the Sudan. He controlled a victorious army and troops of cheap workers. His political religious edifices already had the characteristics of mass production. And at the age of 8, he owned a harem of women who subsequently bore him 100 children. Moses, the founder of the Jewish Christian patriarchy, received his education and moral conceptions at the palace of this Ramses and his predecessor circa 1300 BC. Ra, the sun, was believed to fight daily the serpent of darkness known as Zet, later Apopis. Zet was originally the ancient cobra goddess Azet of matriarchal pre-dynastic Egypt. It was officially declared that law and order were possible only so long as the cobra goddess was kept under the direct control of the pharaoh and his priests. In this way, they were saving the people from the dark serpent, the dark mother. But just as attributes of the snake and bird goddess Neith were retained in the classic Greek Athena, so attributes of the ancient cobra and vulture goddess Azit, Nekebt, were retained in Isis. She wore a cobra on her forehead with cow horns flanked by feathers. Hathor also continued to be worshipped by the people as the great cow goddess. Mayat, the ancient mud matter mother goddess who symbolized the order of the universe, now became known as the Eye of Horus, that is, the eye of the sun, or Ta, and of Ra. The Egyptian word for eye was Azet, very like Azit, and Mayat was the embodiment of the primordial Uraeus cobra. To her was assigned ultimate wisdom and danger, rebellion and chaos, and she was allowed to retain these qualities so long as she was firmly contained within a male godhead, or his eye, and magically guarded by the king. In other words, Mayat embodied the dangerous elements of the ancient classless culture of the native Egyptians, who worshipped the ecstatic goddess and her energy. They had constantly to be held in check by political, military force and priestly dogma. All the religious, spiritual, and cultural values that had been symbolized by the moon of Isis were now strategically transferred by the priest to the sun cult, coming under male control. The surviving moon religion in Egypt remained in the hands of women, but it was the sun god and his stolen powers that publicly ruled. This was the pattern. The sun hero who vanquishes evil in the form of monster serpents or dragons was originally a moon hero like Hercules, and as such the son/lover of the great goddess. In Moon Mysteries, he overcame death in ecstatic self-transcendence, experiencing luminous oneness with her. But when he becomes the patriarchal sun hero, he kills the mother goddess in her dark underworld serpent aspect. Instead of transcending his ego, he transcends the whole world, cosmic union giving way to worldly conquest and destruction of the sources of life. He destroys life in the name of conquering death. Jungian psychoanalysts interpret this process as the liberation of the individual ego, the male ego, of course, from the quote unquote forces of darkness and the quote unquote the unconscious, the mother. The hero's action in rescuing the maiden from the dragon symbolizes, Jung says, the freeing of his own anima, his essential self, from the quote unquote devouring aspect of the mother. This almost suggests that woman in herself is merely a projection of the male anima. And indeed, that's what women are in most psychoanalytical systems. Jungians have never shown an awareness of the politics of mythology, or of mythology as the history of the pre-literate real world. The sun hero is doing more than liberating his ego from the mother. He is liberating his being from responsibility to the being of the world. He liberates himself by arrogantly and recklessly destroying and interconnecting webwork of which he is a part. And then the tragic hero, the tragic hero is surprised when he looks around himself and sees nothing but wasteland and death. Alexander the Great slew no dragons. Instead, he slashed through the Gordian knot with his sword. Knots symbolize the goddess as great weaver of the life web. Knots are sacred to witches and used in magic spells. Rhyme and meter, in fact, and other poetic chanting devices are linguistic knots used to bind up, to concentrate the magic energies of language. The necktie was originally a magic device, a spell knot against throat colds. By impatiently and arrogantly cutting the magic knot with his sword, instead of going into a trance or waiting until he knew how to untie it, Alexander was historically signaling the triumph of patriarchy. The sun hero slashes through the timeless web of interconnecting life energy and lays it all waste in order to enjoy swift satisfaction, fame, and conquest. Conquest of what? Of the fact that life is paradox. One, the fact that psychic powers are deeply hidden and dangerous, needing to be guarded by wisdom, the serpent guarding the treasure. And two, the fact that their release can cause destruction as easily as integration. The sun hero wars against the double-edged reality of the cosmic process, slashing through paradox, denying cyclic recurrence and the serpent wisdom that comes with it. Refusing to believe that his ego must die before the true magic power can be safely revealed. From Marduk to Superman, he is a little boy warring against the subtle serpentine nature of life, demanding it be made neat, simplistic, logical, unambiguous, designed as a flat stage for his triumph and nothing more. In The Second Sex, Simone de Beauvoir catalogs male hatred and fear of woman because she presents him with the ambiguities of life and death. His classic response to these ambiguities is denial and conquest. The organ the man penetrates is the same as that which gives birth to the child. Man finds it repugnant to come upon the dreaded essence of the mother in the woman he possesses. He is determined to disassociate these two aspects of femininity and tends to keep away from woman during her menses, when she is pregnant and when she is in lactation. The old woman, the homely woman, arouse hatred mingled with fear. In them reappears the disquieting figure of the mother when once the charms of the wife have vanished. Man wishes simultaneously that woman be animal and plant, in that she be hidden behind an artificial front. He is delighted with his domination of her. Born from woman's flesh, entering her womb in love, entombed in a female earth in death, man's horror of his quote unquote own carnal contingents is projected on women and on the world in quote unquote heroic acts of slashing, denial, and domination. Patriarchal religions and political states are the institutions of this dominion, and warfare is its tool, its mechanism. Among the Bronze Age warrior tribes spreading over the Neolithic earth, the acquisition of wealth through raids and conquests became a powerful factor in dispossessing women or matriarchal cultures and keeping them dispossessed. The loot from raids and battle belonged to the victorious men, as did the land conquered by sword and broadaxe. Women were an important part of the victor's loot. The Bronze Age warrior's world was neatly divided between the victorious male and his spoils, and everything: women, children, animals, land, and resources. All the rest of life constituted the spoils. This is why patriarchy's inaugural epics and myths, from the Mahabharata of Vedic India to the Greek Iliad to the heroic age epics of the Hebrew, Teutonic, and Celtic peoples, are all the same: an endless glorification of war. These warrior tales clearly describe a new battle-loving aristocracy that was breaking up the old established matriarchal world order with ferocious conquest and formidable iron weaponry. All the ancient unwritten laws of human intercourse were broken up also, as the warrior made his own rules, fiendishly designed to make himself come out on top every time. The sun god or sky father of the invaders was everywhere imposed on the indigenous earth and moon worshiping people. Where the great mother was not eliminated entirely, she was quote unquote married to the conquering sky father. In epics, folktales, and customs, she was retold into a harmless, powerless wife. She never appears again with any power except the pejorative powers of the quote unquote jealous, nagging wife or the seductive bad woman, Jezebel, whore of Babylon, and so forth. The pattern was repeated everywhere. The Sumerians, who invaded Mesopotamia circa 3000 BC, plundered the superior civilization of the settled matriarchal inhabitants and put their own solar king on the throne. The solar king was surrounded by solar priests who rewrote religion into a mythic spiritual rationalization of war, conquest, and royal hierarchy. Since the sun god rose to power through war and conquest, it follows that the mythology, popular epics, and religious doctrine of worldwide patriarchy should stress and glorify the virtues of warriors. Fascism is inherent in a patriarchal worldview. Life came to be seen as a battleground in which the victor deserves his spoils. The Indo-European Aryan peoples were tall, big-boned, and light-skinned. They entered history with a superior war technology, where wagons drawn by donkeys had earlier been used only to transport goods and travelers. The Aryans turned them into horse-drawn war chariots. Driving these chariots using iron weapons, nomadic Aryans swept down in huge hordes from the regions of the Russian steppes and the Kazakh. In several migrations over millennia into India, Mesopotamia, Greece, Europe, they looted, killed, and enslaved the smaller, darker agricultural goddess peoples who were trying to live in their bloody pathway. Everywhere they settled, the Indo-Europeans established themselves as a priestly, intellectual, and warrior elite concerned mainly with military activities and administration of conquered territories. The conquered did the work. Racist theories equating darkness, evil, women, earth, passivity, impurity, inferiority, etc., in a grand master slave equation with Aryans as the masters are everywhere closely bound up with the defeat of the goddess worshiping women cultures of the southern regions by these iron dynamos from the north. The Celts were perhaps of or related to such Aryan origins, called Keltoi by the Greeks, who first recorded them in 900 BC. They were tall, blue-eyed tribes that entered Europe from the east and swept across to the Atlantic. By the 3rd century BC, much of the territory from what is now Turkey to Scotland and Ireland and south through Spain was Celtic. Invaders that they were not patriarchal. Robert Graves has traced their Ogham script back to Anatolia and relates the original Celtic people to the remains of the Neolithic matriarchies of the Near East. Since ancient Anatolia, now Turkey, was once called Galatia, and branches of the Celts were called Galatians or Gauls, this connection makes sense. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote of the Celts, "Their wives are to every man the most sacred witness to his bravery. Tradition says that wavering armies have been rallied by women. They believe that the sex has a certain prescience, and they do not despise their counsels or make light of their opinions." The Celts did not own slaves or believe in capital punishment. Their tribal councils were attended and often presided over by women, and their inheritance of property and also kingship was matrilineal. Their male leaders were elected and they had a reputation for democratic practices. Whether they had origins similar to the Indo-Europeans or not, as the Celts moved into Europe, they assimilated much of the native Neolithic culture. Ancient pre-Celtic influences survived liberally among Celticized people in Ireland, Wales, Brittany, and the Basque Country, where survivors of the Stone Age matriarchies gathered around the North Atlantic. In Celtic law and custom, women were relatively free and powerful. They enjoyed greater economic, social, and sexual autonomy than women in present day Britain, France, or America. The early Celtic Christian church was suspect to the Roman Catholic orthodoxy precisely because it was pro-woman. Women celebrated Mass. Women priests, called conhospitae, administered the sacramental wine while male priests distributed the wafers. St. Patrick and Roman Christianity finally ended Druidic worship in Ireland, as in England and France, but the Irish church retained much of its pagan mysticism. Wales and Ireland, even in medieval times, preserved Celtic language, art, and literature, including the visionary Olaf and bardic tradition of the goddess with its sacred tree alphabet. Jean Markel in Women of the Celts notes that the Gauls of France were Romanized very early and accepted Roman patriarchal law along with Roman Christianity. This was not the case in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland, probably because Roman soldiers were never heavily stationed in these British outposts. The Tuath tribe was the basic political unit in Ireland, owning the land communally. Cattle, not land, was the basis of wealth and the medium of exchange. Women also owned herds. The ruler of the Tuath was commonly a man, but the queen was entitled to 1/3 of all war booty. There were many famous queen warriors like the British Queen Boudica in 61 BC. Powerful legendary women like Queen Mauve of Connaught were undoubtedly based on real people. Celtic women owned their own property and were free to choose their mates or husbands. In marriage, women didn't enter legally into the man's family but retained independent status and property. Desiring divorce, the woman simply took back her belongings and dowry. Marriage was not a religious ceremony, and there was no concept of adultery. There were even annual marriages entered into by both men and women, in which both parties agreed to be bonded for 1 year. At the end of each year, the bond was mutually renewed or abolished. Polyandry was practiced by some tribes. Children belonged to the Tuatha. Legal contracts were made by the wife independently of her mate, and women were often the economic heads of families, with daughters inheriting equally with sons. Celtic heroes were named after their mothers, and heroism was not confined to men. When upper status Celts officially mated, she gave him a fine horse and a sword, and he gave her a fine horse and a sword. The mutual exchange of nobility was the ceremonial bond. Homosexuality was common among Celts and accepted. Male warriors were frequently lovers. Since sex was not related to religious moralism but to honor, bisexuality was considered normal. This is a signature of shamanic people. Celtic priests, the Druids, and Celtic oracular priestesses who followed more ancient traditions of ecstasy prophecy were often homosexual or bisexual. The Celtic priestess was similar to the Nordic vulva, who traveled the Scandinavian countryside, setting up large platforms covered with pelts from which she uttered prophecy and in trance answered questions about the future. The Voluspa saga covered with pelts from which she uttered, the Voluspa saga, or the soothsaying of the vulva, is such an utterance by a legendary seeress. All these practices link the Druids, Celtic, and Nordic priestesses with the present day shamans of Asia and the ancient techniques of mantic utterance going back to the European Stone Age caves. When the all-male, highly patriarchal Roman troops entered Europe, as their historians tell us, they were often confronted by Gallic, Teutonic, and Celtic tribes led by warrior queens. Roman soldiers engaged in hand-to-hand combat with armed women, who they described as equal in size to the tribal men and fiercer in battle. The tribal bond of identity between the European women and men made them hard to persuade or to defeat. One of the clever devices used by the Roman military to divide and conquer the barbarians was to mock the tribal males for being ruled by women. Romans took captured men aside and laughed at them for allowing their women to be powerful and influential. The Roman army sold its bill of Roman goods to many Teutonic and Gallic males, promising them enhanced power and pleasure in the new regime if they would only turn against their women and become dominators of women like the Romans were. When the tribal males succumbed and disavowed their strong women as leaders and equal partners in war and love, the native tribes of Europe collapsed into disarray, and Rome moved into the continent without further serious opposition. From the beginnings of sun god patriarchy to the present day, imperialist invaders have used this sex ploy to divide and conquer an indigenous people. To drive a wedge between women and men is the best way to demoralize a people. To get men to despise and control their women is to turn them effectively against the very source of their being, against their mothers and their partners and the earth itself. Earth as a being rather than a piece of property. Wherever and whenever it can, imperialism attempts to co-opt the belief energy of colonized males in this way by challenging their manhood vis-a-vis powerful and independent women. The sun god's troops can always be identified by their manipulative misogyny and by their political relation to women as slaves, not as partners. This characteristic of imperialistic armies then becomes a device, a tool to further demoralize and rob the energies of a colonized people. Through imposition of patriarchal law, religion, and customs, imperialists try to create among the conquered two hostile classes of humans, the male versus the female, no longer bound to each other by mutual respect and common history, but by mutual fear, antagonized by mutual guilty need. The manhood energy of conquered males is diverted away from rebellion and revolution and channeled into aggressive macho behavior toward women. Conquered, colonized, and enslaved males are told by their conquerors, in effect, you can't beat us, but you can beat your women. The history of imperialism is the history of this device in operation. On the heels of the woman mocking Roman army came the woman cursing Christian missionaries, blaming all the conquered males' troubles on their evil women. Governments and religions manipulate colonized males into a betrayal of their own lives and their own people by first persuading young men to prove manhood by despising the female. And then native males are enrolled in the armies of their conquerors as terrorist national guards or death squads upholding fascistic dictators in power. These young men are rewarded by being allowed to rape, torture, and slaughter their own people, whom they have been persuaded to despise. Thus does the sun god enlist male troops in his war against the female earth and the earth's women. Why does this device work? Because the relation between the sexes is always very delicately balanced, very fragile. Balance is maintained by generations of ritual and custom. These are easily destroyed when people are invaded and colonized. The male ontological situation in particular is very fragile. In both hunting and war, men experience the acquisition of things they have not themselves produced. This can swell the ego's sense of power. Among Mother Goddess Stone Age people, as among Aboriginal hunting and gathering people everywhere, this danger is balanced by ritual propitiation and by the strong, intact spiritual perception that life is given, not taken. The aggressive war god ideology of patriarchy counters this perception, this humble sense of life, with another: to the victor belongs the spoils. Under the sun god, for the first time, the male ego is given power over the source of life. Weaklings wait for the gift to be given, real men just take it. The Bronze Age celebration of war and hunting, seen as manly virtues and male sport, became precisely the celebration of power over women and over the female earth. It is the products of women's labor, women's bodies, the body of Mother Earth herself, which are the spoils. Even Freud could see it subliminally. Through her sexual power, he analyzed woman is dangerous to the community. The male ego, all social structure, rests on her ontological fearsomeness, displaced to the father. Kings and other authority figures are slain by the people not so they may be free, but so they can take on themselves a heavier yoke, one that protects them more absolutely from the terrible or exploited mother. The evolution of paternal domination into an increasingly more complex and powerful state system administered by men is thus, in Freud's view, a continuance of the primal repression, which has as its primal purpose the ever wider exclusion of women. Freud saw this, but in his patriarchal eyes, such a misogynistic repression and exclusion was necessary for the maintenance of civilization. Historically, imperial troops and native armies do not maintain this repression and exclusion of women by external force of arms alone. Patriarchal religious doctrine is the internal mechanism of oppression, God's pistol in the skull. European pagans were conquered ultimately not by the Roman eagle, but by the Hebrew sun god Christ. In his name, missionaries preached the ultimate nihilism or nihilism, the God-willed evil and worthlessness of earthly life, made foul at its source by woman's sin, and the apocalyptic goal of complete spiritual absorption into the heavenly sun, whose holy fires burn all away all flesh. The bomb, of course, is the apotheosis of the patriarchal sun god. Man no longer needs to worship the sun. He can make his own and force the entire earth to bow down before it. The American hemisphere has its own sun god. In legend, the Mexican Aztecs originated to the north of Mexico. Their tribe was ruled over by a witch, Malinozaxal, whatever, who had magic powers over all wild animals, birds, spiders, and plants. In a dream, her brother Huitzilopochtli appeared to a priest, telling him to destroy the witch. Look, I'm not gonna keep saying these names. Okay, I'm gonna try it again. Huitzilopochtli, whatever, promised that the Aztecs would win power and glory not through the old female ways of sorcery and enchanted being, but through male willpower and ruthless conquest, through strength and valor of heart and arm. Huitzilopochtli was the Aztec war god. Following his priest, the Aztecs overthrew their women and their witch. In one legend, as the moon, a very wicked woman, she is beheaded and dismembered. Some speculate that Aztec rites of human sacrifice began here at the origin of Aztec identity as sun warriors, with the ritual sacrifice by the war god of his sister, the moon witch. At least here began the Aztec treks south toward Mexico City and many generations of conquest and dominion. Natal, Nahatal, whatever, thought was great and complex. In its highest reaches, the original bisexual Omechiel, the dual lord, creates the world for pleasure. Life is a magic spectacle. Omechiel's divine dream in which human beings perform and entertain her/him. In this ontology, the Aztecs' intellectual origins as the people of the moon witch are very clear. Quetzalcoatl also was one of the world's most advanced gods of peace, poetry, and learning. As the plumed serpent, he represented the shamanic yoga values of the snake and bird goddess, self-knowledge and transcendence through luminous experience of the three brains. But with growing secular abundance and power, the Aztec sun god, the war god, prevailed. Quetzalcoatl, the god of peace, fled Mexico as a fugitive. The mystic, militaristic worldview of Aztec sun god religion was elaborated by a priest and royal counselor, Lasalel, in 1398. Lasalel declared that the whole purpose of human creation was to provide blood to feed the sun, and the Aztec Empire was the official provider of this blood. As a military dictatorship, the Aztec Empire engaged in continuous war for the sole purpose of capturing victims for sacrifice. At the peak of this priestly sun feeding, hundreds of people a day had their chests slit open and their hearts torn out. The bloody bodies were tossed down the temple pyramid stairs and piled up at the base on top of the Melina coil stone. A giant circular carving showing the moon witch totally dismembered. Lachiel had proclaimed that the tribes of Mexico were to be plundered for their flesh, the bodies rolled up and offered like warm tortillas to the sun. This was ruled by terror for some time. The entire social, economic, cultural, and religious life of Mexico was very effectively organized around this terror. Lest we dismiss it as barbaric, we should remember that under the reign of the nuclear sun god, attended by his global military priesthood, the entire modern world is ruled by the same terror. The jealous god. In ancient Sumeria, sheepfold also meant vulva. In Sumeria and Near Eastern myth and custom, the shepherd king was consecrated in a sacred marriage to the queen of heaven, Inanna Ishtar. Under the eroticized veils of the beautiful young queen was the primordial great mother, she of the fruitful Neolithic garden. As Thompson points out, the shepherd king Dumuzi ensures the prosperity of his people by being a good lover to the goddess Inanna. The biblical King David was also a sacred shepherd. His sensual and ecstatic songs of earthly love, so untypical of the Bible, derived from the ancient love rites of the shepherd king and the goddess. Her Canaanite names were Ashira, Astarte, Ashtoreth. The settled people of the Old Testament, like everyone else in the Near East, practiced goddess worship. The Old Testament is the record of the conquest and massacre of these Neolithic people by the nomadic Hebrews, followers of a sky god who then set up their biblical god in the place of the ancient goddess. The biblical Hebrews were a nomadic, pastoral, and patriarchal people, tribes of sheep herders and warriors who invaded land belonging to the matriarchal Canaanites. Both Hebrews and Canaanites were Semitic people. The Canaanites lived in agricultural communities and worshiped the orgiastic, ecstatic moon mother Astarte. As Old Testament stories relate, the Hebrews sacked, burned, and destroyed village after village belonging to the Canaanites, massacring or enslaving the people. A series of brutal invasions and slaughters described typically by theologians and preachers as a quote-unquote spiritual victory. In this way, the Hebrews established themselves on the land along with the worship of their sky and thunder god Yahweh or Jehovah, calling themselves his quote unquote chosen people. Yahweh's male prophets and priests, however, despite their political victory over the Canaanites, had to carry on a continuous struggle and fulmination against their own people, who kept backsliding into worship of the Great Mother, the goddess of all their Near Eastern neighbors, for she had originally been the goddess of the Hebrews themselves. This constant fight against matriarchal religion and custom is the primary theme of the Old Testament. It begins in Genesis with the takeover of the goddess's garden of immortality by a male god, and the inversion of all her sacred symbols, tree, serpent, moon fruit, woman, into icons of evil. Of the two sons of Eve and Adam, Cain was made the evil brother because he chose settled agriculture or matriarchal. The good brother, Abel, was a nomadic pastoralist patriarchal. The war against the goddess is carried on by the prophets' rantings against the golden calf, the brazen serpents, the great harlot and whore of Babylon, the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, against enchantresses, pythonic diviners, and those who practice witchcraft. It is in the prophet's war against the Canaanite worship of stone idols, the triple moon goddess worshipped as three-horned pillars or menhirs. One of her shrines was on Mount Sinai, which means mountain of the moon. Moses was commanded by the Lord to go forth and destroy these idols who all had breasts. We are told monotheism began with the Jews, that it was the great spiritual invention of the religious leader Moses. This is not so. The worship of one God, like everything else in religion, began with the worship of the goddess. Her universality has been duly noted by everyone who has ever studied the matter. Monotheism, once thought to have been the invention of Moses or Akhenaten, was worldwide in the prehistoric and early historic world throughout the Paleolithic and Neolithic ages. As E.O. James wrote in The Cult of the Mother Goddess, it seems that Evans was correct when he affirmed that it was a monotheism in which the female form of divinity was supreme. The original monotheism of the goddess is perhaps most clearly shown by the fact that, in Elizabeth Gold Davis's words, Almighty Yahweh, the God of Moses and later Hebrews, was originally a goddess. His name, Ayahu Anat, derives from that of the Sumerian goddess Inanna. Yahweh, like all male gods, was first the bisexual goddess herself, then her son, then the lover of the goddess, a shepherd king. In his process of individuation from the goddess, he first appeared alongside her, as in the time of Jeroboam, the goddess shared the temple with Jehovah. Eventually, he was turned by his priest and warrior followers into the supreme and only God. To enforce this new regime, the old goddess religion was damned, her people slaughtered, and the mostly stolen mythology of the new male god was written down by male prophets, a word that also meant poet, and thus given textual authority as the word of God. But still, the unimprovable original maintained her influence in the hearts, bodies, and minds of the people. So deeply ingrained was the goddess cult in Palestine that it survived all attempts at drastic reformation by the Yahwists until the end of the monarchy. Baal is one of the gods hated so drastically by the biblical Hebrews. Baal is Lord. Baaltis means mistress and fair one. And this goddess was directly related to the Baal of the witches, Beltane in pagan Europe. Whatever the Old Testament prophets have to say about these heathen idols, we must take with very large grains of salt, remembering that the prophets were the leaders of a holy political war against the people who worshiped the goddess. Moses then was not the inventor of monotheism or the recognition of one God. He was rather one of the chief male priests and architects of the new religion of one male God against the Neolithic goddess. In When God Was a Woman, Merlin Stone suggests that the ruling Levites, the Hebrew priest caste, were in fact of Indo-European Aryan origin and lineage, belonging to that pastoral warrior tradition of male sky gods, gods of light. In the biblical Leviticus, these Levite priests introduced the earliest, most punitive and misogynistic laws against women, yet written down in those times. They seemed consumed with hatred of the goddess and of women, especially the Canaanite and other neighboring matriarchal women who, in sensual joy and freedom, practiced their ancient moon rites. The Levite priesthood were intent on instituting patrilineal property and inheritance rights and the father-dominated family, based on women's total submission, social degradation, and spiritual disinheritance. It follows that any sexual, economic, spiritual, or cultural freedom and autonomy in women, their own tribal women, or any women in the neighborhood, was seen by the Levite priest as a threat to their new regime. The Levites were themselves an elite class, like the Hindu Brahmins, living in luxury and serviced by slaves. It is also true that Moses, the tribal leader and chief priest of the Old Testament Hebrews, lived at the palace of Ramses II, the great pharaoh dictator of Egypt. Ramses II was the secular architect of the sun god political regime in Egypt. Moses represented the captivity of the Jews under this pharaoh and based a good deal of his religious political ideology on this understandable resentment, as the Bible records. But Moses was also well treated in the Pharaoh's palace and was educated there. Doubtless, it was the political success of Ramses' secular spiritual sun god organization that inspired Moses to try to construct the same kind of male god political order for his own people. It is also true that the Hebrews spent generations of captivity in Babylon, and the major myths of the Old Testament, the garden story, the flood story, the mythic historic struggle between the ancient agricultural goddess people and the new Bronze Age war god elites, were not original with the Hebrews, but taken by them from Semitic Babylonian legend and literature. Pre-patriarchal Levite priests and priestesses originated in Sennaim, which meant land of the moon, and they wore headdresses in the shape of lunar crescents. Sin was the Babylonian moon god, and Sennaim might have been Babylon or Sumer. Both Yahweh and the Islamic Allah began as lunar gods, consorts of the goddess. Indeed, the Levite priests were originally serpent priests of the Great Mother. Levi is related to serpent, Leviathan, the world dragon of the goddess. Whether the biblical Levites derived from Aryan Indo-European roots or were Semites influenced by the all-conquering Indo-European warrior influences of the Bronze Age, we don't know. But just as the later misogynistic and aesthetic Essenes were once ecstatic priests of Artemis, it is very possible that patriarchal religion in the Near East, including the biblical religion of Yahweh, began in a violent revolt of these newly wealthy male priesthoods against the goddess they once served. In The Gate of Horn, G. Rachel Levi analyzes the character of Yahweh as the psychological historical projection of a Bronze Age people growing apart from their ancient ways. The Hebrew tribes were pastoralists on the move, showing the restlessness of mind and ego characteristic of the Bronze Age. They were no longer immersed in the mutual effort of ritual, the cyclic goddess rituals designed to maintain the equilibrium of seasonal recurrence and the growth and renewal of man and beast. Their concept of God correspondingly became detached from earth as they were experiencing themselves as detached, becoming separated, individuated, chosen as a people no longer bound to the earthly cycles of the mother. As a result of this separation of the divine idea from its natural and animal affinities, the means of contact becomes gradually ethical. It is ironic that the concept of the male god and people's relation to him becomes more ethical as the behavior of his Bronze Age male followers become correspondingly more greedy, violent, plundering, and corrupt. But this is a paradox we cannot resolve, except to say that ethics can be a substitute for being there. The means of contact between the Hebrew tribes and their God was ethical in the sense of becoming more rationalized, linear, individual, and intellectual. The old ecstatic holistic experience of oneness with the earth and the goddess was gone. God could no longer be known, but instead had to be thought about and thought toward. The patriarchal priesthood must design verbal descriptions of God in the form of rules for how to act to get this God's attention. Because God is no longer all pervasively there, looking out from the inside and in from the outside. Ethical maps are written down to tell the mind and soul how to reach something that is acknowledged to be distant. As people separate more and more from oneness within the body, within the earth, within the cosmos, religious doctrine takes on the form of instructional maps on how to get there and how to get back. But maps based on God as a misogynistic male cannot take people back to the female source, nor can an anti-earth, anti-physical God return us to the holistic epiphany of body, mind, and spirit inhabited as one. In Deuteronomy 16:20, it is said, "You shalt not plant any tree as an Ashira beside the altar of God." The Ashira was the Neolithic goddess Inanna Ishtar, Astarte, Ashtoreth, Ashira, or the symbol of the goddess. It was a conventionalized or stylized tree perceived as she and planted therefore at all altars and holy places. This Ashira represented the goddess as Yurikatu, the green one, the Neolithic mother-daughter of all vegetation, of agricultural knowledge and abundance. Yahweh's absolute hostility to the Ashira was the political hostility of the nomadic pastoral Hebrew people, or their priesthood at least, to the settled matriarchal cultures and their goddess beliefs. It became a psychological hostility to the entire living earth, doctrinalized in the biblical text. You must completely destroy all the places where the nations you dispossess have served their gods, on high mountains, on hills, under a spreading tree. You must tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred poles, Ashiras, set fire to the carved images of their gods, and wipe their name from that place. This hostility to the living earth, to its deities and symbols, and to all free manifestations of its life can sometimes be seen in the way some fundamentalist and especially Mormon churches are built, at least in the American West. Every green tree, flower, or bush is stripped away from the stark stone anti-terrestrial arrogance of the buildings. The Old Testament texts record the heroic age of the Hebrew people, the war god epics of their priestly and warrior caste. The Bronze Age saw an explosion of such epics throughout the Near East, Egypt, and India. Gilgamesh appeared as the ego of man, a new male being building a hostile identity vis-a-vis woman. mocking and dismissing the ancient mother goddess in acts ranging from ritual desecration and mythic rewriting to the sacrilegious rape, massacre, and plundering of whole settled peoples. In the Old Testament of the Bible, written circa 900 to 300 BC, this ego of man is set up as the Hebrews' new God. Yahweh, the pastoral god of cattle breeding, warfare, moralistic wrath, and misogyny, is the newly militant, self-aggrandizing, and righteous male ego enthroned as God the Father, enemy of the mother. Bronze Age raiding, mass slaughter, and secular conquest of settled matriarchal peoples by the mobilized patriarchal war machine were ubiquitous activities not confined to the Hebrew tribes. The new element added by the Old Testament writers was the concept that became holy war. The Father God not only justified but commanded the slaughter of religious enemies, of people who believed differently, in particular of people who believed in the old religion of the Neolithic goddess. The Hebrew warriors then were not just keep seeking conquest and wealth for personal glory like other Bronze Age sun god warriors and epic heroes. No, their righteousness comes from the fact that they were also seeking to impose the right God, their new idea of the right God, on all their neighbors. Textually, the Old Testament becomes the first handbook of holy war, the first time such an ideology was written down as the rules of the game, as the game itself for a whole people. Both Christianity and Islam recognize the Old Testament as a sacred text. The historic fanaticism of both religions derives its holy war fervor and rationale from the words of the biblical prophets, represented as the word of God. These words incite and justify religious war as the will of God. Yahweh is called the jealous God. What was Yahweh jealous of? Of the goddess and her lover, of their sacred sexual relation itself, and of its domination over the minds and hearts and bodies of generations of Neolithic people. This is why the God and religion of the Bible are identified so clearly from all other preceding gods and religions. The Bible, God, and his religion are based on a violently asexual or anti-sexual morality never before seen on earth. Sex, the source of life and pleasure of love, becomes the enemy of God. All the ancient people of the world embodied the fused birth, life, and death giving powers of earth in a mother goddess. Recognition of this paradoxical functioning of earth was universal. The Bronze Age Hebrews apparently perceived this primordial paradigm of earth as birth mother, sex mother, and death mother, all three in one, and couldn't handle it. They feared and or resented it so profoundly that in their religion, unique among all world religions, they wholly exterminated the mother and her earth, and thereby evolution itself and the cycles of its processes from their concept of deity. Nothing of mother and her earth, nothing of sacredness remains but Yahweh, the war and morality God. Yahweh, who alone among all male gods of the earth never has intercourse with the female. The yang has its yin. Sky fathers have earth mothers. Even the Vedic and later Indian male gods have female principles or other halves or wives with which they copulated. Not Yahweh. Yahweh is the only male god in the history of the world who never made love to a female or to the earth. In Christianity, this extraordinary phenomenon is continued in a son born without sex. From a sexless virgin mother who counsels his male followers to eschew sex and femaleness forever if they want their spirits to reach heaven. Thus did the ancient Hebrew Bible writers deal with their male fear and hostility toward the female sex by eliminating the female sex entirely from the creation or purpose of the world. Biblical misogyny was not exclusively a spiritual opposition to the goddess on the part of Yahweh's priesthood. It also was part of the Bronze Age political project of dominating large numbers of people via a royal priestly elite. Female blood was a sacred element in the agricultural rituals of all Neolithic people, including the matriarchal Canaanites. Blood was poured over sacred stones. Female blood, menstrual blood, was the signature of the psychic, physical bonding of humans through the spiritual laws against, the signature of the psychic, physical bonding of humans through the blood of their mothers and of the mother. Thus, in Leviticus, the Levite priests wrote down extremely punitive taboos and spiritual laws against female blood, menstrual blood, childbirth blood. What had been sacred for so long, the mother's bleeding for life, was written as a process of filth, shame, and physical spiritual corruption. When we know the significance of the ancient complex of woman, moon, menstrual blood in the Neolithic religions of humanity and stretching back beyond even the Paleolithic, no doubt, then we can see the biblical portrayal of menses, woman, and sex as icons of filth and evil as a preeminently political move. This move was designed to take control over human life and the burgeoning Neolithic abundance by destroying the original communal bonding of people through the blood of their mothers, and to replace this with an enforced new hierarchic bonding based on the pastoral idea of a father god, keeper and breeder of herds, heads of cattle and capital. Female blood is tabooed, is no longer the medium of a spiritual communal bond. The new covenant is made with male blood, blood from the foreskins of circumcised male infants. This new tribal bond was elitist as well as sexist. The tribal god Yahweh was elevated to a one and only universal God, but still Yahweh was believed to recognize only the blood of Hebrew males in this special bonding. Only Hebrew males can achieve this special relationship with God. For something like sacred group bonding, menses to be denigrated to a corrupt process, as it is in the Bible, required a psychic overturning that was enormous. It wrenched the sexes out of balance to this day. We have still not recovered in the West from that act of primary alienation from the source of our earthly lives. No matter how sophisticated our technologies or how secular our lifestyles, we in the West, because our culture is so historically saturated with biblical imagery and worldview, still tend to be ruled by archetypal models of a male pastoral God whose power comes not from giving birth or enhancing life, but from dominating and breeding cattle herds as a sign of egoistic individual wealth, and dominating women as unclean but profitable cows as well. The puritanical morality of the Old Testament comes in some part from a misconstruing of ancient ritual and taboo. As Theodore Roszak points out in Where the Wasteland Ends, the Hebrew prophets looked at Epiphany and saw idolatry. Just so, they looked at ancient sacred technologies and saw moralisms. Pagan Neolithic people did not have sex morality systems per se. Sex was sacred. Flesh was a manifestation of spirit, but spirit was related to energy, human and divine energy, and energy was experienced as easily imbalanced, mischanneled, or wasted. Pagan people designed rites of purification or energy concentration for special activities or occasions in which the soul energy was at risk. At risk through the intensity of the encounter or change it would be undergoing. The soul, as the sense of personal identity and belonging, was at risk in archetypal ontological situations: birth, puberty, mating, killing, eating, death. So, Men would undergo at least 3 days of sex abstinence before a hunt or battle. Ritual abstinence and purification were undergone before a mating or birth, or at puberty or after a death. These purifications / concentrations of spirit energy were a way of encountering any major life change or soul transformation which could threaten the balance of identity, personal and communal life, transpersonal. Whether these were or were not related to sexual activity, these ritual purifications were not moralisms. They were, in the phrase of Mircea Eliade and Jerome Rothenberg, technologies of the sacred ritual ritual means of focusing and maintaining spirit energy in all crisis or archetypal transformations. The sacred among pagan people is related to magic supply because both are experienced as energy arts, techniques of gathering and directing energy towards a numinous or trans-physical goal. When the Hebrew prophets overthrew the great goddess and her pagan religion, they kept many of those purification techniques, but divorced them from magic or spirit arts. In doing this, they created moralism. One abstains from sex at certain times, not to focus mind, body, spirit energy, but because sex is bad, immoral. The Judeo-Christian religious systems, in their own worldviews, have wholly denounced and extirpated the magic rites and reasons behind purification ceremonies, but retained the purification technologies themselves, ending up with a psychological fetish for cleanliness, purity, etc. Cleanliness is next to God, and so forth. Really, since God is everything, cleanliness runs a very poor second. Sexual moralism builds on this fetishism to a pathological degree, filling people with an alienating sense of their own and others' bodily filth, with a fear and abhorrence of the body and its activities, and with projective systems that insist on the uncleanness of strangers and others, including the doctrines of racial purity and racial impurity. These sex moralisms and purity fetishes, originally a misreading of pagan energy challenging techniques, have laid the basis for racism as well as misogynistic sexism. They also lead to revulsion against the sick, the elderly, the disabled. In the Old Testament, priests of Yahweh were required to be pure, physically perfect. No person with an illness, with a handicap or blemish, or non-male body style, no blind or deaf person, no lame person, no epileptic, no incontinent person, no dwarf or hunchback, and no woman whatsoever is allowed to approach the altar of God, not because their energy might be temporarily or accidentally diffuse or unbalanced, but because they are unclean in the eyes of God, spiritually inferior. Biblical homophobia is another manifestation not only of sex moralism, but of the Hebrew prophets, political hostility toward the people and practices of other religions, specifically goddess religion. As Thompson writes, the image of bisexuality is universally stressed in shamanistic practices. We will go over that later. The excessive Hebrew condemnation and punishment of homosexuality, which was, after all, a common and universal Neolithic practice, was not simply a revulsion toward a particular unnatural sexual activity. It was an attack on all shamanistic ecstatic religion against the bisexual image, theory, and practice of the great goddess. The balancing of female and male energies was always the goal of Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic religions. Bisexuality, male homosexuality, lesbianism are the symbolic and real enactments of this balancing vision. To live the other in the self, to live the self in the other, to free oneself from gender by enlarging gender experience to total experience. As stated in their texts and doctrines, the spiritual goal of the pastoral Hebrew prophets and kings was the separation and mutual hostility of the female and male energies. Their ultimate political goal was the punishment of the female by the male, to the degradation of both. Biblical homophobia, the condemnation of people engaging in homosexual acts to death by stoning. The cursing of homosexuals beyond the grave was a direct consequence and mechanism of the Hebrew prophets' project to vilify and destroy goddess cultures as evil while setting up their own anti-sexual god in her place. Homophobia is a necessary psychological attribute of the religion of Yahweh. If Yahweh never has sex with the female goddess or mortal, nor never has sex with the male, then what is Yahweh? He is pure spirit, that is, a Hebrew male above sex, above life. This is supposed to indicate Yahweh has transcended or outployed the Neolithic great goddess. What effect did this new Yahweh of the biblical prophets have on the lives of Hebrew women, who, like all other Neolithic women, had once enjoyed the freedom, dignity, and dynamic energy of living as women in the universe of the goddess? That is a story for Jewish women to tell. It seems historically true that, as Christian feminist theologian Rosemary R. Ruther writes, Hebrew women of biblical times were the first to undergo a God-willed social, physical, and spiritual oppression that has since become the experience of all women in the West and in the East under various forms of the same patriarchal misogynist worldview. The picture of woman obtained from the Old Testament laws can be summarized in the first instance as that of legal non-person, where she does become visible. It is as a dependent and usually an inferior in a male-centered and male-dominated society. Under the purity taboos of Leviticus 12, it was ordained that Hebrew women who gave birth to sons were unclean for 7 days and must purify themselves for 33 days following a childbirth. A woman bearing a daughter is unclean for 66 days, and she must then make a sin offering as an atonement for bearing a female. In 1 Samuel 21:4, it is said, men are holy who stay away from women. Yahweh and his prophets had a strong urge to punish Hebrew women for their sensuality, vivacity, and autonomy under the goddess. Here is one of many such passages from Isaiah 3:16-17. Moreover, the Lord saith, because the daughters of Zion are haughty, and walk with stretched forth necks and wanton eyes, walking and mincing as they go, and making a tinkling with their feet, therefore the Lord will smite with a scab the crown of the head of the daughters of Zion, and the Lord will discover their secret parts. Meaning, sexual punishment, sexual humiliation, and pejorative sexual epithets are disturbingly common in this book of male prophets and holy men. As Ruth Hermans Green says in her wonderful book, The Born Again Skeptic's Guide to the Bible, the prophets are faithful in recording the Lord's propensity for humiliation of the female sex by comparing sinful cities and nations to it. The thrashing of evil cities, cities following other religions as whorish and harlots and places of fornication, is common to Yahweh and his prophets. But Hebrew cities do not escape the continuous flow of misogynist cursing either, as in Lamentations 1:17, Jerusalem is as a menstruous woman. When holy war mentality is joined with such human hatred, there is the targeted slaughtering of women and children as blood bearers of the hated neighboring religions and cultures. The book of Ezekiel reeks with it. slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women, but come not near any man upon whom is the mark. Fill the courts with the slain. Ezekiel 9, 6 through 7. In the Old Testament is the metaphor of the king who builds his house above a privy. This seems to refer to ecstatic orgiastic rites practiced by the Canaanites in honor of the goddess, which the Hebrew patriarchs and prophets could not see as anything but prostitution and vile whorishness. The opinion of the Hebrew patriarchs that human sexual activity is basically vile and of the gutter, ultimately of the devil, was echoed centuries later by Tertullian, an intellectual father of the early Christian church, who proclaimed that woman is a temple over a sewer. Split in the garden. The biblical myth of Eve and Adam and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden is another tale of separation of the female from the male at Yahweh's command. According to Hebrew and Christian teachings, Eve, the first woman, is the cause of the fall of humanity from paradise into earthly suffering. She is the source of original sin. In Genesis are all the recognizable elements of the much more ancient mother goddess myth, symbol, and ritual. Here is the garden of the goddess and her wise cosmic serpent, the tree of knowledge with its dark soma fruit, the fig of the Cretan goddess, which became for Westerners the magic apple of the European white goddess. Here also is a strong trace of Near Eastern creation mythology, which tells how the Great Mother shaped the first human beings from earth dust and her own saliva, and then breathed her mouth of life into them. Eve means life, and Eve is called the mother of all living. Adam means son of the red Mother Earth. These legends, these creation myths, go back thousands of years before the Hebrew patriarchs wrote the Bible. But in Genesis, it is a father God who creates all life, and the first woman is born from a man's body. A very interesting biological reversal. In this opening book of the Bible, the historic political ideology of the patriarchs is clearly stated. The new male God forbids Adam and Eve to participate in the sacred mystery rites of the great goddess. They may not eat of her fruit and gain transcendent knowledge. Of course, Eve, who is the priestess of the goddess, disobeyed Yahweh's command. She tries, with the magic aid of her serpent, to persuade Adam to partake with her of the narcotic fruit and sexual rites, leading to ecstatic illumination and rebirth in the goddess's garden of immortality. And this is original sin in the established doctrines of the Hebrew and Christian religions. Lilith in Hebrew legend was the rebellious woman created before Eve. She was portrayed as part snake and wearing wings, the winding serpent who is Lilith, and was blamed by Yahweh for having tempted Eve to reveal and initiate Adam into the mysteries of the garden. Lilith represented the ancient Canaanite worship of Astarte, Ashira, and also Ishtar of Babylon. Her relation to the very old snake and bird goddess is obvious, and her rebellious, naughty mysteries were those of yoga, of kundalini, and spinal illumination. Mysteries and techniques indigenous to the Near East, as well as to Europe and India, until the Hebrew patriarchs set out to censor them. Far into medieval European Christian imagery, the serpent in paradise is pictured with a woman's head and breast. Significantly, Eve's punishment for her sin consists of patriarchal marriage. Her desire must be only for her husband. She must leave her garden and follow him over the barren, male-ordered earth, condemned to unwanted pregnancies and painful childbirth. In other words, patriarchal marriage, in which she is isolated from the women's collective and deprived of her ancient knowledge of herbal contraceptive and narcotics used for painless labor. She is no longer priestess and midwife to the goddess. She will now bear children bitterly, and they will belong to the man. She must also passively make love to Adam on her back, he enacting the male sky father over her meek female earth. She must play the role of corrupt matter, chained to a husband forever, striving to free his immortal spirit from her. Eve is still every woman, with other world creation myths reduced to only fairy tales. The Old Testament Genesis is still treated with seriousness and respect in the Western political and cultural world. Even people who are not practicing Jews or Christians are affected by it, for the patriarchal notions enshrined in Genesis are at the base of all our cultural, political, and economic institutions. In contradistinction to the U.S. Constitution, we might add American law and custom have always been heavily influenced by the Bible, because the men who make law and custom have been raised to believe the Bible is the truth. No need to point out to women in the 1980s that anti-abortion legislation, job discrimination, pay inequity, and marriage laws against women are still roundly justified in the U.S. Congress as God's will. Genesis is quoted to prove that God designed women to be dependent, helpless helpmates to men. Any legislation or custom that might free women from such economic or biological or social dependence, anything that might further women's autonomy of choice, is bulldozed by the Bible quoters as a threat to the family. The biblical patriarchal family, which has indeed historically depended on female slave labor. Sex inequity, otherwise known as God's plan for man, has for 2 millennia been a major bastion of support for a class economic system designed to profit the few by underpaying the many. God is used to justify this system because all else fails to justify it. And the God of Genesis, who wrote the rules for sex inequity in our part of the world, now sits in the executive boardrooms of most global corporations, making sure these archaic but lucrative discriminations are interwoven tightly into our high-tech futures. Indeed, in July 1969, an American manned spaceship left a microfilm of the Bible buried in the dust of the moon at taxpayers' expense. One giant step backward for womankind and the moon. The Genesis story of Cain and Abel, the sons of Eve and Adam, continues the process of the Hebrew patriarchs' political struggle against the goddess. As already noted, the good brother Abel was a shepherd like his nomadic sky father, worshiping prototypes. The bad brother Cain was an agriculturalist, representing the settled farmers of the neighboring matriarchal people of Canaan. Throughout the Near East and Mesopotamia generally, the agricultural abundance of the Neolithic was the Garden of Eden, a fertile and long-sustained paradise of earthly and spiritual existence. The Bronze Age raiding, plundering, and spreading warfare by sky god warriors and nomadic pastoralists was breaking up this garden into fortress cities and destroying Eden. Perhaps the nomadic sheep herders and cattle herders deeply coveted the settled agricultural life as much as they officially despised it. At any rate, ritualized, goddess-oriented Neolithic agriculture was bad until the new male order could take it over and work it for gain. Generally, when men took over control of agricultural work, developing the plow and other large-scale earth-working tools, they also began to develop ideas of the male as the cosmic generative principle. Watching grain seed germinating as if of itself in the earth, they could conceive of the male seed as containing already in itself the whole germ energy of life. Long into the Middle Ages, people believed that a drop of male semen contained a complete miniature fetus. Some notable scholars claimed to be able to see this tiny being and even drew pictures of it. Until the Bronze Age, the growth of the grain seed was believed to be caused by emanations of the moon, combined with nourishment from rain and the earth. The law of matriarchy had governed agriculture. All produce gathered not according to the right of the seed, but the right of the soil. The seed takes on the nature of the soil, not the soil of the seed. But male dominated agriculture evolved the concept of the earth as inert matter, simply a nourisher of the male generated life seed. By analogy, the human or animal mother was simply a passive receptacle for the father's seed, which contained the child they believed. When seed is thrown into the earth or into the womb, there is no difference, wrote Galenos. Plowing was experienced by men as forced sex, a rape of the earth, the rape of dumb matter by enlightened spirit, and woman was as the humble furrow where proud man sows his seed. The female ovum or egg wasn't discovered until 1827. So for 2,000 to 4,000 years of patriarchy, all religious, philosophical, biological, and medical theories were based on the assumption of the male as the sole generative physical and cosmic force. From being seen for so long as little more than openers of the womb, so fertilization could occur between women and the spirits, men in the Bronze Age came to see themselves as sole parents of life. The male god swelled and erupted with this heady recognition, and like the Sumerians drowned in inky semen, we still live in the ontological fallout. Elaborated by generations of male brains, the Bronze Age vision of women as earth to be conquered and made fertile remains intact. Freud saw libido as wholly male, and from that theorized that all creativity is male also. Marriage under patriarchy was then seen as a symbolic union of sacred spirit or man and profane matter, woman. Patriarchal marriage is conceptually a kind of legal mechanical attempt to reunify the original male-female principles split apart by the Father God. But the reunion is all on his terms, dualistic role-playing rather than organic gynandrous fusion in the psyche of each partner. Husband and wife are one, and the one is him. Women have been made to act out the unintegrated negative aspect of yin and yang. Woman is earthbound. Through her, you grow roots in the dark, the hidden in earth and magic. The flesh is sinful. Sinful is she. Deepest inside man is spirit, and spirit wants to climb into freer spheres. Because of this, the spirit fights the body, the flesh, and is ashamed when he lets himself be led astray. The classical Greeks practiced ideal homosexuality, platonic love. The goddesses Sybil and Ishtar had allowed ecstatic sodomy in their temples and made no prohibition of physical love between males. We will go over this later. But as Robert Graves points out, ideal homosexuality was an attempt by the male intellect to free itself spiritually from the goddess, to make itself cosmically self-sufficient. Now that makes more sense. It was a philosophical extension of patriarchal culture strategy. If the physical female world can be reduced to meaningless material, then the idealizing mind, male, is justified in manipulating, exploiting, and even destroying it. And thereafter, the male mind is defined by its ability to organize the natural world into rational categories for objective study and use. Socrates, the proponent of ideal homosexuality, was contemptuous of mythic and poetic thought processes. He turned his philosophical back on ancient mysteries and trained himself to think, quote unquote, scientifically. In fact, Socrates thought verbally, turning multidimensional, multisensual life process into a linear dialogue between aristocratic male minds. Socrates, the world's most famous obsessive talker, complained publicly that his wife Xanthippe talked too much. She is famous justly for dumping a pot of piss over his head when Socrates once did ponder the nonverbal unknown. However, he appealed to Diotima, the inspired Pythia, to reveal what lay beyond him. And she disclosed to him the essence of the goddess. In Socrates' time, the realities of the ancient Cretan and Mycenaean cultures were remembered only as legends of a past golden age. What remained of mother goddess symbols and rituals were practiced in secret cults by women and country peasants. The Aryan invaders from Central Asia had, in late Minoan times, already begun a systematic falsification of the existing myths. Apollo's priests proclaimed that rational poetic language and thought were to replace the inspired poetic language of the goddess. From then on, poetry, language itself, ceased to be mantic utterance and became a social ornament and political device or rhetoric. Socrates thought that the understanding of myth and symbols was irrelevant to self knowledge. He was also, of course, a townsman. He talked endlessly about life, but was far removed from the sources and consequences of his own living, eating, breathing, pooping, and dying. Ancient myths and rituals were based on tree lore, on seasonal observations of life in the fields, on the body's direct and rhythmic relation to nature's rhythms. But from the time of Socrates, culture in the Western world has meant male urban elite culture based on the intellectual contempt for the revelations and customs of country life. J.J. Bakoven, the first modern researcher into matriarchal studies, was also quite eloquent in his justifications of patriarchal culture. To him, the maternal society was also the undifferentiated unity of the mass. He found exclusivity and privilege abhorrent to Mother Earth, her children living communally and practicing orgiastic sexuality. Paternity, on the other hand, introduced the principle of differentiation and restriction, leading to higher spirituality. The triumph of paternity brings with it the liberation of the spirit from the manifestations of nature, a sublimation of human existence over the laws of material life, while childbearing motherhood is bound up with the earth that bears all things. The father, begetter, stands in no visible relationship to the child. He discloses an immateriality over against which the sheltering and nourishing mother appears as matter and as place and nurse of generation. The son's self-sacrifice to get to his begetter, the father, requires a far higher degree of moral development because the relation is mainly an abstract idea than mother love, that mysterious power that equally permeates all earthly creatures. Bakoven speaks of the formless and orderless freedom of Aphrodite without private rights and property, subservient to matter and natural life, and to the harmony of the universe which they had not yet outgrown. Lost my spot. Okay. Under the moon, the law of matter prevailed. The world of endless becoming with death as the twin of life. She who awakens life works for death. Death is the lot of children born to a mother. But with patriarchy, mother right is left with the animals, and mortality is restricted to matter, while male spirit purified from the slag of matter rises up to immortality and immateriality, a supra-material life belonging to the regions of imperishable light in the halls of the sun. Bakovan gets very elaborate in his praise of the new disembodied Apollonian male soul in its triumph over the ecstatic mystery god, son of the great mother. Apollo frees himself entirely from any bond with woman. His paternity is motherless and spiritual, as in adoption, hence immortal, immune to the night of death, which forever confronts Dionysus because he is phallic. Consistent with this, Bakovan praised the emergence of the male individual ego at the cost of the human community. The individual leaf has no importance of the mother tree. All that is begotten belongs to the mother soil that encloses it. To the patriarchal Greek and Roman, the glory of the city was that it separated him from the fields. It defined him as a political animal. He could completely structure his world with his mind and slave labor, and so free himself from nature. Political is from polis, city. The city was man's number one tool with which he could achieve the manipulation and subordination of the natural world, she. Bakovan accordingly glorified Rome. Rome started the struggle for freedom from nature and natural needs that marks the historical trend of Christianity and replaces it with the political idea that overruns everything and molds everything to a historical linear view of the universe instead of the former cosmic cycle view. The prestige of maternity was banished from the law of the state. Rome cast off natural law, annihilated matriarchal Carthage, and eradicated every trace of the great matriarchal Etruscan culture. Irreplaceable knowledge and experience were lost through this destruction. Bakovan says, however, what justified the colossal destruction Rome brought was the spiritual liberation following the ascendancy of historical consciousness over the natural idea and cosmic law. Western life truly begins with Rome, indeed, great highway builders. Rome rejects the law of material necessity and upholds the superiority of the human mind over the messages of nature, earth, and cosmos. Everywhere he, the Roman male, regards himself as the first factor in historical life. Among Rome's first edicts was the subjugation of women and children to the complete control of the fathers, who were given life and death power over all members of the family. This is called the Bakovan an eminently ethical achievement. But King Servius, who founded the Roman community, was himself probably an Etruscan. He was conceived at a sacred festival of the goddess, the son of his mother, and the Latin League was dedicated by him to the Aventine Temple of Diana. Upper class Roman patricians were solar consecrated. while the plebes, the common people, were dedicated to the Magna Mater, the primal mother. Ceres was their protectress, and the community confided its treasury, its laws, and the decisions of the Senate to her temple, believing nothing could be falsified there. In Athens, also, the popular assembly was identified with Demeter, the Earth Mother. So, the city emerges as man's ultimate attempt to become man-made, born from itself rather than from Mother Nature. The feeling of self-sufficiency he achieves through the city is largely abstract and spurious. The sources of our biological lives remain the same as they always were. They come from matter and land. But city man maintains contact with his natural life sources not through immediate body experience, but through an artificial medium of exchange, money. He no longer works with the earth, he buys it. The ancient energy exchange between humans and nature becomes a money exchange between humans only. Norman O. Brown writes in Life Against Death, money is at the heart of the new accumulation complex. The capacity of money to bear interest is its energy. Its body is that fundamental institution of civilized man, the city. The archaeologists note the complete rupture with the previous style of life, which marks the foundations of the first cities. The institution of interest bearing capital is the key to this abrupt reorganization. A city reflects the new masculine aggressive psychology of revolt against the female principles of dependence and nature. So there arose the city-states, seeds of the modern nations, organized around a professional male priesthood, politicians, and specialist workers living off an often artificially forced agricultural surplus, forced by slave labor in the past, forced by chemicals today. The centralizing ideal of the city-state was an identification of the divine king with the sun god. This new male god ruler was seen as the dispenser of divine justice, order, and measurement. All the ancient functions of Ma'at and the moon goddess. The sun father was the lord of the crops and measurer of the new solar seasons. It was the sun now who was seen to germinate the seed with his phallic sunbeams. A false notion, the sun is a necessary but not a sufficient cause of life. All planets receive sunlight, but only the one with earth and water grows anything. The Sun King also determined the agricultural taxes by which the production of the country was hijacked to support the growing urban elites who lived luxuriously while the landed farmers and peasants were impoverished. Around 3000 to 2000 BC, the life of the citizen began to displace and dominate that of the country villager. The earliest solar wheel was found in Mesopotamia, dating circa 4000 BC. By the time of the Roman Empire, every aspect of life was dominated by the demands and lifestyles of the urban centers. The famous Roman roads built by slaves were meant to transport armies and weaponry outward into tribal territories. The wealth of the plundered earth, in the form of food, metals, and human slaves, was then transported back into Rome to support the increasingly complex way of life at its imperial urban heart. Rome was the central sun, with lines radiating from it in all directions. Highways of power allowed conquest and spread the Roman way, and highways of expropriation carried all the earth's bounty back into city coffers. All roads lead to Rome. The city broke down the organic life of the tribe and the agricultural village. It brought about the final destruction of the matriarchy and instituted the patriarchal rule of abstract urban law and order. Phallic psychology led to aggressive manipulation of life materials, lifestyles, and life energies. and the rape of nature by technical mechanical means. All this was understood as the conquest of male mind over female matter. Living as we do in the full apotheosis of the intellectual sun god's victory over matter, with its results ticking over our heads every second in the form of global annihilation, the boyish enthusiasm of the past 4,000 years over its newly discovered male mind and male seed power can leave us a little queasy. The taste of victory has turned more than a little sour. In the 4,000-year-old Epic of Gilgamesh, our hero sets out on a sacred quest to slay the Sumerian forest demon Huwawa. The purpose of this sacred quest for Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu is, in Thompson's words, to make a name for themselves, a name that can live on after them, a monument to the ego. Because Gilgamesh reasons this is the only way men can conquer death. Because he has established the ego of man on a linear, phallic course, he can no longer return to the cycles of nature or be a part of the organic life and death cycles of the Great Mother. Man's ego and its victories now constitute his whole isolated identity, a historic identity. Gilgamesh does slay the forest demon, who is the mother, and is left alone with his famous name. Civilized, morbidly self-conscious man's desire to overcome earth and death and the bondage of flesh and woman only creates a vaster kind of death for himself, for he is killed off everything sacred. Now he must truly die alone. As Thompson writes, the ego has definitely arrived on the scene of history, and it is screaming out against its cosmic isolation. Before, all the processes of culture were connected with the cycles of nature. In death, tribal man simply returned to the Great Mother. But when civilized man sets up walls between himself and the forest, and when he sets up his personal name against the stars, he ensures that the now isolated ego will cry out in painful recognition of its complete alienation in the fear of death. Significantly, the murder of the forest always leads to the desert. Deserts always seem like ancient environments, but in fact, they are the youngest environments on Earth. Most deserts are man-made. They are what's left after everything else has been conquered or used up. In the Qumran and Marabat caves, in dry cliffs on the shores of the Dead Sea, hundreds of scrolls have been found since 1947, some of them dating 1,000 years older than any Hebrew copy of the Old Testament seen before. These scrolls constituted the library of a Jewish monastic community that was located in the area before and during the time of Christ. It is believed by some that the historic Christ, the man who was Christ, spent time in this community and incorporated many of its doctrines and worldviews into his teachings. Others believe that the idea or figure of Christ was based on several men, teachers of righteousness, who came from this or similar communities of that time. As the Dead Sea Scrolls texts and other extra-biblical writings dated centuries before Christ show, Jewish religious mystics of radical sects such as the Essenes were approaching and enunciating a vision of the Jewish Messiah many generations before Christ. A Messiah in strong contrast to the Orthodox teachings of the Old Testament prophets, though fulfilling many of their ideas. The Messiah of the Jewish Dead Sea Scrolls sects was not only to be a political historic redeemer of the Hebrew people, he was also being shaped in their visions into a divinely appointed and apocalyptic savior figure. In the order of the Qumran community's messianic banquet, it was ritually stated that God, Yahweh, would beget this Messiah. According to a major authority on the Dead Sea Scrolls, John Allegro, we appear then to have in Qumran taught already the idea of the lay Messiah as the Son of God, begotten of the Father, a Savior in Israel. The Messianic banquet was reserved for the male initiated elect of the community and was seen as a pattern or rehearsal of the divine banquet that would be held for the elect who survived the great purging of the world in the last days. This messianic banquet, of course, prefigures the Last Supper. So many basic elements and ideas of Christianity are written down in the Dead Sea text. In fact, that many Christians were very upset when the scrolls were first revealed and their contents published. They did not want to give ancient Jews credit, not simply for the birth of Jesus, but for almost the entire ideological substance of their Christian religion. Study of the scrolls reveal, however, that this credit is due. The scrolls contain hymns of the Qumran sect, hymns which refer to angels and the devil, Belial, the angel of darkness, Satan, to the children of light versus the children of darkness, and to the hope of redemption by God from the sins of the world. The scrolls speak of the Prince of Light who was about to come and save the faithful Jews, not only from Roman domination, but most of all from the corrupt Orthodox Jewish priesthood in Jerusalem, apparently the major enemies of this monastic desert communities. In hymns and other texts, the Qumran initiates spoke of the redemption of human sin by God's grace and elaborated their doctrine of human perfection, the new covenant of Christianity. In fact, the sect called itself the New Covenant. The Qumran sect began sometime between 135 and 104 BC and ended in AD 70. Their ideas of the Christ-like teacher of righteousness, referred to also as the anointed one, Messiah, predate the New Testament by at least a century. In a world seemingly falling apart through incessant warfare, social and political corruption, the Qumran community practiced strict ascetic discipline, regulating every aspect of daily life. They were communal in all things, practicing humility, opposing lying and negligence. Some of their penalties were extreme. For indecent exposure during bodily movement, the initiate was penalized by 30 days deprivation of rations, which were thin enough. Foolish laughter brought down the same 30 days. For unnecessary self-exposure of the genitals, the penalty was 6 months. Such practices were designed to wean the male spirit from all attachment to or identification with the earth or the human body. Indeed, they conditioned a revulsion to these things. Though the Jewish Essenes were traditionally celibate, apparently there were some female initiates in some of these communities. But the hymns, doctrines, and customs of the Qumran communities were very misogynistic. In Allegro's words, women were seen essentially as potential seducers of men from the straight and narrow way. And the documents shown an obsession with whores and the snares of the flesh. In one scroll from the fourth cave is a hymn warning about harlots. In perversion, they handle her befouled organs of lust. They penetrate the orifice of her legs in wicked acts and behave with guilty rebelliousness. Pits of darkness, the sins within her skirts are many. Her garments are the murk of twilight. Her adornments are tainted with corruption. Her bed is a couch of defilement, depths of the pit. She is the foremost of the ways of sin, and alas, all who take her will come to ruin. Her eyes glance keenly hither and thither, beneath her voluptuous heavy lids, looking for a righteous man to seduce him, a perfect man to make him stumble, upright men to lead them astray, those chosen for rectitude to shun the commandment. As Allegro notes, all such warnings against the wiles of the harlot were in reality denouncements of pagan religions. They also record a general attitude about women and sex that led most of these desert monks to renounce marriage. Who was Jesus Christ? Clearly, the New Testament Messiah came from or was at least deeply influenced by these Jewish Essene and Essene-like monastic communities. Somehow, the New Testament writers melded the Qumran concept of a teacher of righteousness with the Hebrew prophetic tradition of a historic Messiah or political redeemer of the Hebrew people. Most of the New Testament disciples, including the gospel writers, were Jewish males who could easily have absorbed this mixture of Orthodox and radical Jewish messianic ideas, including their Qumran elaboration into a divinely appointed Savior or Son of God who promised redemption of the soul from sin and even salvation of the elect at the end of the world, which was seen to be imminent. These Jewish messianic ideas were then interwoven by the gospel writers of the world. By the gospel writers or by the time itself, which was volatile, with the ancient pagan images of the dying God. For the gospel stories of Jesus are thick with symbols pulled from Babylonian, Sumerian, Egyptian, and in general, Neolithic rites of the vegetation deity, Tammuz, Dumuzi, Adonis, Osiris, Dionysus, etc., who is sacrificed on the mother tree for the renewal or rebirth of the life of the world. The passion, the self-sacrificing ritual of Christ does not have its roots in intellectual ideas, but in the primordial passion of the great mother who dies or whose beloved daughter or son dies to ensure that the world will grow green again with spring. It is not an accident that the birthday of Jesus is at the winter solstice when the sun is reborn, or that his death and resurrection correlate with the spring equinox when the world is reborn. Dark Virgin Mother of Guadalupe, 1982. Jesus Christ was the last vegetation deity of the Near Eastern world, or all that remained of one, pitting himself against the rational corruption of urban Rome as it extended into the ancient Holy Land. But a vegetation god makes no sense separate from earth, ecstatic cycles, and the female moon. The Jewish Essene-like communities had broken utterly with pagan vision and rhythms. They were anti-earth, anti-body, anti-woman. In the ascetic aridity of the desert, they raised up disembodied male spirit against the flesh, the world, and the devil. The Neolithic garden of oneness with the goddess was gone. What was left was a dry and fervent patriarchal war of the spirit against everything alive. Jesus Christ, the last vegetation god of the Neolithic Near East, bloomed in a desert. He bloomed as a devastating sun withering to all life. All he could die for was an afterworld. And we are going to end it there for tonight. Again, thanks everybody for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you would like to donate, the information is in the description or scrolling across the screen. Tune in tomorrow for Life as a Mistake. Please don't forget to comment if you have any books that you'd like me to read. All the information for websites and such are in the description. If you're on Facebook, check out the YouTube. If you're on YouTube, check out the Facebook, the website, sisterforsisters.com. It is in revamp mode, but you can check it out, leave me feedback, whatever, however. Thanks again for listening. Shalom. Peace be unto you. Good night.